When I saw my husband leaning against the doorway, car keys in one hand and phone in the other, I didn't think much of it. Until he glanced at me, too calm, too kind. "Take the car today," he said, tossing me the keys with a strange smile. "Go wherever you want. Take your time." There was something rehearsed in the way he said it, like it was part of a script. I felt a pang in my chest, a quiet panic I couldn't place. I asked him if he was sure. He nodded and walked away, already typing something on his phone. As I stepped into the passenger seat, the driver looked at me through the mirror, and for a second, I forgot how to breathe. It wasn't the way he looked, or the silence between us. It was the question I was suddenly afraid to answer: what if I wanted this escape too much? What if the person who made me feel seen wasn't the man I had vowed to spend my life with? What if the real betrayal had begun long before the first touch? Before I confess the truth I've buried deep, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? And have you ever had a moment when a harmless decision turned into something that changed everything? There's something humiliating about preparing a dinner that no one will eat. I had set the table for 2 candles, cloth napkins, even the nice glasses we got as a wedding gift from people I barely remember now. I waited in silence for over an hour before finally calling him. Straight to voicemail. Again. And again. When he finally walked through the door, it was nearly 10. He didn't take off his shoes. He didn't even look up from his phone. "Sorry," he muttered, his voice dry. Meeting ran long. He dropped a bouquet on the table. The flowers looked expensive but smelled like nothing. Cold, scentless beauty, just like the ring still sitting on my hand. I didn't ask questions. That's the dance we'd fallen into. I pretend to believe, and he pretends to care. The plates on the table remained untouched. "I hired a new driver," he said between texts. "Starts tomorrow." I blinked. That was it? No apology, no explanation. Just another decision made without me, another change in our routine that I had no say in. The next morning, I met him. The driver. He was early, standing by the car in a crisp black jacket, hands calmly folded. He nodded politely when I approached, eyes meeting mine for only a second before he opened the door for me. "Good morning," he said simply. Something about the way he said it, soft but deliberate, made me feel acknowledged. Not admired, not desired. Just seen. And that was more than I'd felt in years. We drove in silence. I watched the city blur through the window while he adjusted the mirrors, tuned the radio, and asked if the temperature was comfortable. "Fine," I replied. My voice came out smaller than I expected. He didn't press. He simply nodded. And somehow, his silence felt more generous than any of my husband's recent words. Later that evening, I found myself thinking about the driver. Not in a romantic way, not yet. More like remembering a stranger who held a door open just when you were sure the world had forgotten you existed. The next day, I had errands to run. My husband tossed me the keys again. "He'll drive you," he said, without lifting his eyes from his phone. It was raining when I got in the car. He handed me an umbrella, even though he was soaked himself. I offered a thank you, barely meeting his gaze. As we drove, he asked if I wanted music. I said yes, unsure why I suddenly wanted the car to feel less quiet. He chose jazz, soft, instrumental, just enough to fill the space between us. At the store, he helped me carry the bags. Didn't say much, just followed and opened doors and waited. Always waiting, always present. When we got back into the car, he offered me a small towel for my hands. It wasn't part of his job. He just noticed. That night, my husband came home late again. No flowers this time. No excuse either. Just a kiss on the forehead and the scent of someone else's perfume clinging faintly to his shirt. I didn't ask. I was tired of asking. But something shifted inside me. Not anger, not sadness. Just a subtle awareness. Like the first sign of a fever before the symptoms arrive. The following week, the car rides became more frequent. He was always on time. Always silent and less spoken to. And yet, something began to build in the air between us. Not desire. Not yet. Recognition. One afternoon, as he adjusted the mirror, our eyes locked for a second too long. Just long enough to register something unspoken. Just long enough for me to realize, I missed being looked at like that. Not because I was beautiful. Not because I was his boss's wife. Because I existed. We never touched. Never flirted. But every ride with him felt like a conversation we weren't allowed to have. That Friday, I wore lipstick. A subtle shade I hadn't used in years. I caught him glance once. Just once. And then look away. The silence in the car that day wasn't empty. It was loaded. When we pulled up to the house, I lingered before stepping out. "Thank you," I said, my hand on the door. He nodded. "Anytime." I didn't look back as I walked away. But I felt the weight of his gaze resting between my shoulder blades. Inside the house, the silence returned. The echo of footsteps, the hum of the refrigerator, the absence of conversation. My husband was upstairs, on another call, door closed. Always closed. And I, downstairs, alone, couldn't help but think that the person who made me feel most present in my own life wasn't the man I shared a bed with. It was the one who sat silently behind the wheel. The next morning, I hesitated before stepping outside. I stood by the front window, watching the car idle in the driveway, steam rising from its hood into the cool morning air. My reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, the soft scarf around my neck, the way I had styled my hair, a touch more deliberate than usual. I told myself it was because of the cold, not the driver waiting outside. That would have been easier to believe if I hadn't reapplied my lipstick twice. He stood beside the car, as always, patient and still. I opened the door, locked it behind me, and walked down the steps. Our eyes met briefly, and he offered a small nod. "Good morning," he said, stepping forward to open the passenger door. I murmured the same, slid inside, and tried to steady my hands on the leather seat. He adjusted the mirror and pulled out of the driveway. The silence in the car felt thick, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind that begged for meaning but refused to say it out loud. We drove through the early traffic, the city still waking up, the light not yet sharp enough to reveal every detail. I watched buildings go by, familiar streets that now felt strangely distant. He didn't speak. Neither did I. Halfway to the market, rain began to fall. A soft drizzle at first, then heavier, splattering against the windshield. He turned the wipers on, their rhythmic movement matching the growing pulse in my neck. A red light stopped us near the bridge. He glanced into the rearview mirror. Our eyes met again, just for a second. But this time, the glance lingered. There was something searching in his gaze, something careful. We continued driving, and I forced myself to look away, focusing on the blur of wet pavement instead. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into nothing. At the store, he followed me inside, helping carry the bags without being asked. I noticed the way he walked, quiet, respectful, never too close, never too far. I wanted to say something casual, something neutral to ease the strange pull I felt between us. But the words stayed trapped in my throat. As we walked back to the car, the rain poured harder. He opened the trunk, carefully placing each bag inside, shielding them from the rain with his own coat. When he turned back to me, soaked through, he opened my door first. I stepped inside, watching him run around the front of the car, hair dripping, jacket plastered to his back. When he sat in the driver's seat, he paused for a second, catching his breath. He pulled a towel from under the seat and handed it to me without a word. "Thank you," I said softly, taking it, more for the gesture than the function. He turned the engine on. Jazz played low through the speakers again, the same gentle kind we'd listened to days before. I wondered if it was his choice or coincidence. We pulled into traffic. I realized we hadn't spoken more than a handful of words, and yet something had shifted. I closed my eyes, letting the music fill the space between us. I wanted to ask him what he was thinking. I wanted to ask if he felt it too, this strange, quiet electricity that seemed to hum in the cabin whenever we were alone. But I didn't. Instead, I asked him to take the long way home. He didn't question it. Just changed lanes and turned toward the park. The road was lined with trees, their leaves wet and dark, clinging to the branches like secrets. I watched the world pass by in a blur of gray and green. "I like this route," I said, finally breaking the silence. He nodded once. "It's peaceful." That was all. But it felt like a door opening. I shifted in my seat. "Do you always drive in silence?" He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Only when silence says more." I looked out the window again, suddenly aware of how quickly my heart was beating. When we reached the edge of the park, he slowed the car and parked near a small overlook. Rain tapped gently against the roof. He turned off the engine. The music stopped. The world became still. Neither of us moved. The windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside. I turned to him. Our eyes met again, not through a mirror, not in passing, but directly. There was a tension in the air, not aggressive, not even urgent. Just inevitable. And then, quietly, naturally, we kissed. No words. No explanations. Just the brief press of something long denied, something buried beneath politeness and distance. When it ended, we both looked forward, as if the windshield might offer answers the world couldn't. I opened my mouth, but nothing came. He cleared his throat, started the car again, and pulled onto the road. The rest of the drive passed in silence. When we arrived home, he stepped out quickly, opened my door, and retrieved the bags. I followed him to the front porch. "Thank you," I said, my voice low. He nodded, handed me the bags, and turned to leave. I watched him walk back to the car. He didn't look back. He simply climbed in, started the engine, and drove away. Inside, the house felt colder than usual. My husband wasn't home yet. I stood in the foyer, still holding the bags, unsure what to do next. There was no plan, no next step. Just the weight of what had happened, resting quietly on my shoulders like the coat I hadn't worn. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain against the windows, the echo of a moment I couldn't take back. Not because I regretted it. But because something had begun, something I couldn't name, couldn't control. And I didn't know what it would cost. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, even though the house was still and silent. My husband hadn't come to bed until late, and even then, he had slipped under the covers without a word. I heard the familiar sound of his phone vibrating against the nightstand, the screen lighting up his expressionless face, and then silence as he turned his back to me. Now, the sun had barely started to rise. I lay in bed for a while, trying to find something solid in the whirlwind of thoughts swirling in my mind. Guilt tugged at the edges of my stomach, but it wasn't sharp. It was slow, soft, and confusing. Not because I didn't know what I had done, but because a part of me didn't feel sorry for it. There was no grand plan. No fantasy about running away or starting something new. Just a moment that had unraveled itself with such quiet inevitability that I wasn't sure how I could have stopped it, even if I had wanted to. I dressed carefully that morning, not for him, not even for the driver, but for myself. A clean blouse, a coat that hadn't left the closet in months, and a subtle shade of lipstick. Not red. Something softer. I didn't want to look bold. I wanted to feel aware. As I stepped outside, I noticed my husband's car still parked in the driveway. That was unusual. He was always gone before I even poured my first cup of coffee. But not today. Today, he stood near the porch with a cup in his hand, casually sipping, dressed but not in a hurry. "You're up early," I said, adjusting my purse on my shoulder. He shrugged. "Just thought I'd slow down a little today." There was something in his voice that didn't match the words, an ease that felt foreign. I nodded, offered a smile, and walked past him without waiting for more. The car was already there, of course. The engine running quietly, windows slightly fogged from the morning chill. He stepped out as I approached, just like he always did, and opened the door for me. "Morning," he said, his voice even, unreadable. "Morning," I replied, sliding into the seat. He didn't look at me longer than necessary. There was no hesitation, no lingering silence like the day before. Just a smooth pull out of the driveway and into the street. But the air inside the car was different. Tense, not with discomfort but with something held back. I could feel it in the way he gripped the wheel, in the way he didn't reach for the music. I didn't know what to say. Should I mention what happened? Should I pretend nothing did? Every scenario played out in my head and ended the same way, in silence. Halfway through the drive, I cleared my throat. It felt too loud in the stillness. "I didn't expect you to come today," I said. "I was scheduled," he replied without looking at me. A pause. Long enough to swallow. "Yes. Of course." The rest of the drive passed without another word. We reached the market and, like always, he parked, stepped out, and walked around to open my door. I stepped out slowly, unsure if I should wait for him to follow. But he did. Like always. He took the bags from the trunk, followed me inside, and walked a step behind, like nothing had changed. Except everything had. I moved through the aisles more slowly than usual, pausing longer at items I didn't need, trying to organize my thoughts into something coherent. He remained quiet, occasionally reaching for a higher shelf or placing something into the basket. By the time we reached the checkout line, my heart was pounding harder than it should have been. Outside, the sky was brighter, and the rain from yesterday had left puddles in the parking lot. As we walked to the car, I caught a glimpse of our reflection in a storefront window, two people walking side by side, too far apart to be together, too close to be strangers. He opened the trunk and started loading the bags. I stood by the passenger door, fingers tightening around the strap of my purse. When he finally turned back to me, I spoke, though my voice trembled slightly. "Are you okay?" He paused, eyes meeting mine for the first time that morning. "Yes." "You?" I nodded. But the way I nodded said everything I couldn't find words for. We drove back in silence again. But this time, it wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. When we pulled into the driveway, I reached for the handle, then stopped. "Thank you," I said, "not for the ride." He turned slightly in his seat. "You don't have to." But I did. For many reasons I couldn't explain. I stepped out, took the bags from him, and walked toward the house. My husband was no longer outside. The front door was closed, locked from the inside. Inside, I placed the groceries on the kitchen counter and stared at the clock. Too early for lunch, too late for breakfast. My phone buzzed. A message from him, my husband. Everything okay? I stared at the screen. Was it a real question? Was he suspicious? Was he being thoughtful? I typed back, yes. Why? His reply came seconds later. Just checking in. I put the phone down and went to the sink. Turned the water on, not to use it, just to hear it. Later that evening, he came home at his usual time. Sat at the table while I cooked. Asked how my day was. I answered, sparing no details. Nothing about feelings. Just actions. After dinner, I watched him settle on the couch, scrolling through his phone, half watching the news. I realized then that the house had returned to its regular rhythm. No confrontation. No questions. Just life, moving forward as if nothing had happened. But something had. And even if we never spoke about it, even if the air between me and the driver never again held that same weight, I knew something irreversible had taken root. Something had cracked open. And whatever came next, I wasn't sure I'd be able to close it again. The next few days unfolded with a strange sense of order, as if the world had decided to balance itself by forcing everything back into place. My husband's schedule remained packed but predictable. He was either on a call, on the way to a meeting, or responding to an endless stream of emails. I watched him move through our home like a visitor, always polite, always present, but never truly here. I began to notice the little things more. How he asked me if I needed anything from the store but never waited for an answer. How he would nod at my stories without once looking up from his phone. There was no cruelty in it, just distance. A soft, invisible wall that had built itself up over the years. I didn't blame him. Not entirely. Some of it was me. I had stopped reaching, stopped asking, stopped expecting. I had made it easier for him to slip into silence. Still, I couldn't help but wonder when exactly we had become strangers who shared a bed. Not enemies, not even cold, just separate. The rides with the driver continued. Each one carefully quiet, structured, wrapped in an unspoken agreement to keep things exactly as they were. We didn't speak about that kiss. We didn't refer to it, hint at it, or revisit it in any form. And yet, its presence hung over us like a quiet hum, impossible to ignore. On Wednesday, I had an appointment downtown. Nothing urgent, just a consultation at a gallery where I occasionally volunteered. My husband suggested I take the car. It's better than parking downtown, he said. He'll drop you off, wait, bring you back. No stress. I nodded, unsure whether his suggestion carried a weight I wasn't seeing. But his face remained unreadable. The driver arrived at exactly 9. As always. He greeted me with the same calm professionalism, opened the door, and waited for me to settle in. This time, the radio was already on, classical music, soft and distant, like background noise in a museum. I wondered if it was for me or for himself. As we drove, I found myself watching the back of his head, the way he checked the mirrors, the precise way he handled the turns. Everything about him was careful. Measured. I realized how little I actually knew about him. I didn't know if he had a family, what music he liked, what books he read, if any. I didn't even know his last name. But I knew how it felt to sit in silence with him and not feel alone. The gallery was quiet when we arrived. A few early visitors wandered between the installations, murmuring observations to each other in low, thoughtful tones. I walked through the halls slowly, barely listening to the coordinator as she explained the logistics of the upcoming show. My mind was elsewhere. Stuck between the man who no longer saw me and the one who saw too much. When I returned to the car, he was already outside, holding the door. I nodded in thanks and got in. As we pulled away, I expected the drive to remain like the others, silent, slow, careful. But something was different. He took a turn I didn't recognize. Not the usual route? I asked. Traffic ahead, he replied simply. But I wasn't convinced. A few minutes later, we were driving alongside the river, the road narrower, flanked by trees beginning to bloom. The sky was clear, the sun soft but warm enough to make the world shimmer. Without realizing it, I let out a small breath. It felt like the first full one I'd taken all day. He noticed. You like this road? I don't think I've been this way before. It's quieter. I looked out the window, watching the water move beside us, reflecting the sky like a lazy mirror. I needed quiet, I said, mostly to myself. Neither of us spoke for a while after that. We just drove. Eventually, he pulled off to the side of the road, into a small gravel area that overlooked the river bend. There was a bench nearby, half in the shade, half in sunlight. I turned to him. Why did you stop? He didn't answer right away. Then, I thought you might want a break before going home. I hesitated. But then nodded. 5 minutes. We both stepped out of the car. The breeze carried a hint of spring, damp earth, distant blossoms. I walked toward the bench, sitting down slowly. He stayed by the car, giving me space. But I didn't want space. Not now. Do you always drive people like this? I asked, not looking at him. Like what? Like they matter. He was silent for a few seconds. Then, only when they do. I didn't know how to respond to that. So I said nothing. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees, brushing a strand of hair across my face. I tucked it behind my ear. When I finally stood, he walked with me back to the car. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive. But something had changed. Again. It wasn't a line crossed or a rule broken. It was subtler than that, like a quiet agreement neither of us had signed, but both accepted. When we pulled into the driveway, I didn't move right away. Thank you, I said. He looked at me, then nodded. Anytime. Inside the house, I found my husband in the living room, pouring himself a drink. How was the gallery? He asked, his tone light. Fine, I said, placing my purse on the table. He didn't ask more. Just sat down, picked up the remote, and turned on the news. As the voices filled the room, I stood behind the couch, watching him. I wondered if he'd ever noticed the difference in how I walked now, how I looked at the world. If he ever wondered why I came home a little later, stood a little longer at the doorway, hesitated before unlocking the door. Or maybe he knew more than he let on. But if he did, he never said a word. And I wasn't sure which was worse, that he didn't notice, or that he did, and simply didn't care. The next morning felt different before I even opened my eyes. There was a weight in the air, something invisible but undeniable. My body was rested, but my chest felt tight, as if sleep hadn't quite cleared the residue of everything building inside me. I stayed in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, letting my thoughts drift. I wasn't exactly thinking about him, not directly. It was more the memory of yesterday's quiet riverbend and the way silence between us had begun to feel like its own kind of language. Downstairs, my husband was already in the kitchen, dressed neatly, sipping his coffee and reading something on his tablet. The smell of toast lingered, but no plate had been made for me. That was normal now. We rarely shared meals unless it was with company, and even then, conversation was minimal. Morning, I said, entering the room. He looked up briefly, nodded, then returned to his reading. I have errands to run today, I added, walking past him. He didn't respond right away. Then, take the car. You should get out more. There was something in his tone that made me pause, but I didn't turn around. I simply nodded and continued toward the stairs. I took my time getting ready. Not deliberately, but not carelessly either. I chose a soft blouse, something light, something that felt easy. My makeup was minimal, my jewelry simple. I didn't want to draw attention. I just wanted to feel like myself, or at least the version of me that still existed somewhere beneath the surface. When I stepped outside, the car was already waiting. Just like always. He stood by the door, straight-backed and still, his expression unreadable. There was no hesitation in the way he opened the door for me, no shift in demeanor, but I could feel a difference. A carefulness. "Good morning," I said softly. "Morning," he replied. The door closed behind me, and I settled into the seat, the familiar hum of the engine offering a strange kind of comfort. We didn't speak for the first few blocks. The city passed by quietly, the streets still waking up, people moving with the slow rhythm of a midweek lull. I watched him through the corner of my eye. He kept his focus on the road, but his posture was more rigid than usual. I wondered if he was thinking about the river, about the silence we shared, about the things we didn't say. I almost asked. Almost. Instead, I cleared my throat and said, "Let's stop by the flower market first." He nodded without a word and changed course. The market was quieter than usual, a few vendors setting up their stalls, the smell of damp soil and fresh blooms thick in the air. I walked slowly, letting my fingers brush over the petals of the bouquets. Roses, tulips, lilies, each one beautiful, but none calling to me. Eventually, I chose a small bundle of wildflowers. Imperfect. Asymmetrical. Real. He carried them without question, holding them with surprising care as we returned to the car. Back inside, the silence resumed, but it no longer felt empty. It was full of all the things we didn't need to explain. As we reached the corner near the park, he spoke for the first time. "Do you want to stop again?" I hesitated, then shook my head. "Not today." He nodded, eyes forward. We continued on, and I gave directions to a bookstore I hadn't visited in years. He parked outside, waited patiently, and didn't ask how long I'd be. Inside, I wandered without purpose, picking up books I didn't need, flipping through pages just to feel the weight of paper in my hands. I left with nothing. Back in the car, I placed the wildflowers in my lap and stared out the window. "I used to come here with my sister," I said quietly, not expecting a reply. "We'd spend hours in that little corner by the poetry section." He glanced in the mirror but said nothing. It was enough. On the way home, the air in the car shifted again. He adjusted the radio, and a soft instrumental track played, gentle piano, almost ambient. I leaned back against the seat, closing my eyes for a moment. And then it happened. Not planned. Not rehearsed. Just a single, weightless moment that moved between us like breath. We kissed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fiery or desperate. It was soft. Measured. The quiet answer to 100 questions we had both been too afraid to ask. When it ended, we didn't speak. He started the car again, and we drove the rest of the way in silence. When we pulled into the driveway, I didn't reach for the handle right away. My hand rested on my lap, fingers grazing the edges of the flower stems. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely audible. He nodded once, eyes forward. I stepped out, walked toward the house, and didn't look back. Inside, my husband was still in the kitchen, now cleaning up. The plate I hadn't used was already in the sink. "You were gone a while," he said casually. "Just needed a bit of air," I replied. He didn't press further. He poured another cup of coffee, leaned against the counter, and continued reading. I placed the flowers on the windowsill, arranging them in a simple glass jar. They didn't match the decor. They didn't match anything, really. But I didn't care. All day, I moved through the house with a strange lightness in my chest, the kind that comes not from joy, but from recognition. Recognition of something shifting. Something real. And for the first time in years, I felt awake. Not happy. Not certain. But undeniably, unavoidably present. The wildflowers on the windowsill had started to droop. It had only been a few days, but their bright edges were softening, petals curling inward as if folding into themselves. I found myself staring at them longer than I should have, wondering if I should replace them, water them, or just let them fade naturally. I didn't move. I just watched, transfixed by the quiet, unremarkable end of something beautiful. The house was still. My husband had left early, leaving behind his usual trail, half a coffee in the sink, unread emails blinking on his tablet, a faint scent of cologne that no longer registered as comforting. I stood barefoot in the kitchen, holding a mug of tea that had already gone cold, unsure what to do with the weight that had settled across my shoulders. I hadn't seen the driver since that day. Since the kiss. There had been no calls, no messages. Just space. And in that space, the silence was louder than ever. I told myself it was for the best, that lines had been blurred and maybe, we both needed the distance to breathe. But a part of me, the part that still stirred every time I stepped outside and scanned the driveway, hoped he would be there. He wasn't. Not Monday. Not Tuesday. By Wednesday, my husband began driving himself. "I've got a full day," he said that morning. "No point in making him wait around." I nodded, pretending that the comment didn't sting, pretending that my routine hadn't quietly fractured without warning. Later that afternoon, I opened the hall closet to grab a scarf and noticed something unfamiliar, a small black umbrella tucked behind a stack of shoes. I recognized it instantly. It was his. I reached for it slowly, as though it might vanish if I moved too quickly. The handle was smooth, worn from use. I held it in my hands longer than I should have before carefully placing it back where I found it. I didn't know why it was there, or how long it had been sitting unnoticed, but something about the small object, so ordinary, so practical, felt intimate. That evening, I cooked dinner without much thought. Chopped vegetables, simmered broth, stirred quietly while the radio played a song I didn't recognize. When my husband returned, he commented on the smell, poured himself a drink, and asked about my day in the same tone he might use to ask if we had more paper towels. I gave him the same vague answer I always did. He didn't notice. We ate in silence, interrupted only by the sound of forks against plates. I watched him across the table, trying to remember the last time we had truly spoken. Not about errands, or groceries, or calendars. But really spoken. I couldn't find the memory. After dinner, I stood at the sink, rinsing dishes slowly, my hands moving on autopilot. My reflection in the kitchen window was blurry in the low light, distorted by water droplets. I barely recognized myself. In the quiet of the house, I thought about the road by the river, the breeze, the sunlight on my skin. I thought about how I had felt that day, not excited, not reckless, but awake. That was what stayed with me more than anything. And still, he hadn't come back. The following morning, I found a note on the counter in my husband's handwriting. Gone for 2 days. Conference in Ridgeport. No, I love you. No, we'll call tonight. Just the facts. Like a business trip scheduled on a corporate calendar. I stood there, holding the note, reading it twice. Then I folded it once, tucked it under a cookbook, and began boiling water for tea. The house, suddenly, felt too quiet. Not peaceful, hollow. I wandered through the rooms slowly, passing familiar furniture, framed photos, dusted shelves. I paused at the hallway mirror, running a hand down the length of my blouse, smoothing it at the waist. I looked tired. Not in the way lack of sleep shows, but in the way years do. Still, I dressed carefully. I didn't know why. By midday, I couldn't take the waiting anymore. I grabbed my coat and the black umbrella, his umbrella, and stepped outside. The sky was overcast, but it wasn't raining. I walked without a destination, letting my feet choose the path, turning corners without thinking. It wasn't until I found myself near the South District that I realized where I had gone. Near the garage where the company vehicles were kept. I stood across the street, pretending to study the window of a closed antique shop, watching the parking lot from the corner of my eye. The car was there. The one I had sat in, week after week. I knew it by the slight scratch near the back left wheel. But he wasn't. I stood there for a while, unsure what I was waiting for. After several minutes, I turned and began to walk away. Then, I heard a voice behind me. Low, calm. You're far from home. I turned slowly. He was standing by the gate, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. I was just walking, I said, forcing a calm I didn't feel. He nodded, stepping closer but keeping distance between us. Are you okay? I hesitated, then nodded. You haven't been around. They reassigned me, he said simply. I swallowed. I figured. A pause. Then, I didn't mean to make things complicated. I looked at him, really looked at him, trying to find the part of this that had felt so natural just days ago. It was still there, beneath the words, beneath the silence. I didn't mean to either, I replied. Another pause. Then, gently, he said, maybe some things don't need to be fixed. Just felt. I wasn't sure what he meant. Or maybe I did. I wasn't ready to name it. He walked me to the edge of the sidewalk, said goodbye, and turned back toward the garage. I walked home slower than I had come. When I returned, the house was still as I had left it. My coat went on the hook, the umbrella placed gently back in the closet. I sat in the living room with a cup of tea, watching the wildflowers wilt. One petal fell, landing softly on the windowsill. Things were changing. I couldn't say how, or how far it would go. But something had begun to fade. And something else, quiet, careful, was beginning to take its place. The silence that filled the house in my husband's absence was heavier than I expected. I thought I might welcome the solitude, that perhaps it would offer clarity or calm. But instead, it settled like a fog, muting everything it touched. I moved through the rooms with quiet steps, unsure whether I was trying not to wake something or not to disturb myself. I didn't sleep well that night. I tossed between sheets that felt too big, too cold, the empty space beside me serving as a stark reminder of both what was gone and what had never fully been there. Morning arrived slowly, pulling light across the walls like a curtain I wasn't ready to lift. I got out of bed before the alarm could sound, though it had no reason to. I showered, dressed, and sat at the table with a cup of tea that I didn't drink. The wildflowers were now fully wilted, their stems bent, their colors faded to a soft, tired brown. I didn't have the heart to throw them away. Around mid-morning, a car pulled into the driveway. Not my husband's. I stood at the window, heart pounding for reasons I didn't want to examine. It was him. The driver. He stepped out of the vehicle slowly, hands tucked into the pockets of a dark coat. He didn't look up at the house immediately, instead walking to the passenger side and retrieving something, a small paper bag. Then he looked toward the front door. I opened it before he had a chance to knock. He seemed surprised, though not startled. I thought you might want a ride today, he said quietly. I didn't respond right away. I just stepped aside to let him in. He didn't cross the threshold. He simply handed me the bag. Inside was a single pastry, warm, soft, dusted with cinnamon. "You mentioned this place once," he said. "Near the bookstore." I stared at it, then at him, unsure what to say. Gratitude didn't seem enough, but anything more felt too fragile. "Thank you," I managed. He nodded, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us was still, like a held breath. "I can wait outside," he said. "If you need time." But I didn't need time. I needed to leave the house. I needed to breathe something other than my own doubt. I grabbed my coat and followed him to the car. We drove in silence at first. The streets were calm, the world moving at its own pace. I kept my eyes on the window, watching trees blur past, unfamiliar corners of the city emerging in the distance. He didn't ask where I wanted to go, and I didn't offer. Somehow, we both understood that this wasn't about a destination. It was about movement. Eventually, he turned toward the edge of town, toward a long, winding road that led into the hills. I had only been this way once, years ago. It felt like stepping outside of my own life, into a version of the world untouched by routine. We stopped at a small overlook, the kind tourists rarely found. Below, the valley stretched out in greens and grays, houses dotted far in the distance. Clouds moved slowly across the sky, thick and layered, but not threatening. He turned off the engine, and the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was natural, like background noise finally ceasing. For several minutes, we didn't speak. We just sat there, breathing in the same space. Then, quietly, I said, "I haven't felt like myself in a long time." He didn't respond. But he didn't need to. "I used to paint," I continued, more to the window than to him. "Nothing special. But I loved it." I stopped when the studio became his office. Still no reply. But I knew he was listening. I don't even remember why I stopped asking for that room back. Or when I stopped needing it. He shifted slightly in his seat, not to interrupt, but just to be more present. "There's this thing that happens in a long marriage," I said. "You don't even notice the small surrenders. One by one, you give up little things. A favorite chair. A weekend tradition. A piece of your voice. And then one day you wake up, and all that's left is silence." I felt the words land in the space between us, felt the weight of them settle like dust. He looked out the windshield, then back at me. "You're not silent," he said gently. I turned my face away, unsure how to hold that sentence. We sat there a while longer before he reached for something under his seat. A thermos. He poured 2 small cups of coffee, offering one to me. It wasn't the best coffee. But it was warm. And it tasted like something real. As we drove back, the sky began to clear. The clouds thinned, sunlight slipping through in soft gold streaks. When we neared the city limits, I spoke again. "Will you be here tomorrow?" "If you want me to," he said. I didn't answer. But I didn't need to. He pulled up to the house and parked, but didn't turn off the engine. I sat still for a moment, fingers wrapped around the now empty coffee cup. Then I turned to him and said, simply, "We spent the night together." The words weren't a request. Or a confession. They were just the truth. He nodded, once, and turned off the car. We stepped out together, walked to the door without touching. The air was cool, but not cold. The world felt quieter than usual. Inside, the wildflowers had completely collapsed, their stems leaning against the glass like tired hands. I didn't throw them away. Not yet. The sound of the front door closing behind him echoed more loudly than it should have in the quiet of the house. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to that silence stretch and settle, as if the walls themselves were considering what had just happened. The air was still. The clock in the kitchen ticked in measured, deliberate seconds. I could hear the low hum of the refrigerator. The world hadn't changed, but I had. I moved through the space slowly, pausing at the windows, the counter, the vase with the wildflowers. They were now fully collapsed, their stems curled in on themselves like they had given up. I stared at them for a while, wondering if they had simply mirrored me reaching, blooming, and then folding inward again when the moment passed. But I didn't feel like folding. Not anymore. I cleaned up the kitchen without thinking about it. Dishes into the sink, table wiped, crumbs brushed from the surface. I swept the floor twice, though it didn't need it. My hands moved on instinct, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. Not with him, not even with my husband. With myself. With the woman I used to be, the one I had buried under years of obligation and habit. By the time the sky had dimmed into late afternoon light, I had opened every window in the house. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of early spring. It made the house feel unfamiliar. I liked that. I sat in the living room with a notebook I hadn't touched in over a year. I flipped through pages of half-written recipes, grocery lists, reminders to pick up dry cleaning. Nothing of substance. No thoughts. No truths. Just errands. I turned to a blank page and stared at it. Not ready to write anything, but unwilling to close it again. When my husband returned late that evening, I was still sitting there, the house dim except for the lamp beside me. I watched him walk through the door with his usual tired posture, his bag over his shoulder, his phone in hand. "Everything okay?" he asked casually. "Yes," I replied. He nodded and headed upstairs without another word. No kiss, no questions. Just the weight of routine. I waited until I heard the water running in the bathroom before I stood and went into the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, letting the coolness of the marble seep into my back. My body felt heavy and light all at once. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because of guilt or anxiety, those had long since faded into something more distant. I didn't sleep because I couldn't stop thinking. About the quiet moments, about the drive into the hills, about the way my name had felt when it wasn't spoken but simply understood. By morning, my husband had already left again. A note on the counter said, "Back late. Don't wait up." The handwriting was rushed, the kind you leave on a hotel notepad for housekeeping. I folded it, placed it in the same drawer where I had hidden the others, and made myself breakfast. The doorbell rang just as I finished my tea. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a split second, a flicker of something passed through me, uncertainty, anticipation, maybe both. When I opened the door, it wasn't him. It was the neighbor. An older woman from 2 houses down. She brought a pie and a story about her daughter moving back into town. I invited her in, listened politely, smiled when expected. But my thoughts drifted. She stayed for an hour. Told me about her arthritis, her son's divorce, a new recipe she had tried last week. I nodded, poured tea, kept the conversation moving. I was good at that. It was something I had learned over years of being invisible, how to remain present without ever revealing anything real. When she left, I closed the door gently and leaned my back against it. The silence returned immediately, rushing in like a tide. I looked around the house again. Same walls. Same furniture. But I saw everything differently now. It wasn't just a house. It was a stage where I had been performing the same role for far too long. The phone rang around noon. A number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Later, I listened to the message. It was from the auto service. My husband had apparently scheduled some maintenance on the car I used. They asked if I wanted to bring it in or if the driver would handle it. I didn't call back. Instead, I put on my coat, grabbed my bag, and stepped outside. I didn't plan to go anywhere in particular. I just needed to move. To breathe. I walked through streets I hadn't visited in months, maybe years. Past the old bookstore, the cafe where I used to meet friends before schedules got in the way. I saw a park bench that looked almost like the one by the river, and I sat there, letting the wind pull strands of hair from my face. A child ran past with a balloon, laughing as it bobbed in the breeze. Two teenagers held hands across from me, whispering and giggling in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. I stayed there for a long time. When I finally returned home, the sky had shifted to a softer blue, touched with orange at the edges. Evening was arriving. There was a new note on the counter. My husband had stopped by while I was out. It simply said, "See you tomorrow." No questions. No curiosity. I stared at the handwriting. I recognized every loop and curve, but it meant less to me now than ever before. I turned back to the living room. The notebook still sat open on the table. I picked up a pen and, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I began to write. Not a list. Not a schedule. Not a meal plan. Just words. Thoughts. Feelings. I didn't try to make them poetic. I didn't try to make them neat. I just let them pour out, honest, unfiltered, raw. And as I wrote, I began to feel something loosen in my chest. A small, steady pulse of something I hadn't known I was missing. Myself. I was still here. Somewhere beneath the years, the expectations, the silence, I was still here. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to find her again. The next morning started like any other, but I felt different. There was a stillness in my body that hadn't been there before, not the kind that comes from exhaustion or surrender, but the quiet that settles after something has been named, even if only to yourself. I moved through my routine slowly, deliberately, as if reminding myself with each action that I was present, that I was still here. I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, not out of vanity, but out of curiosity. My face was older, yes, marked by time and expression, but it wasn't unfamiliar. I traced the lines near my eyes with the tip of my finger and thought about all the laughter and worry they held. For the first time in years, I didn't turn away. Downstairs, the kitchen was filled with morning light, and the wildflowers had finally given up their last bit of color. I carried the vase to the sink and emptied it gently, watching the petals drift and fall. I rinsed the glass clean and placed it upside down on the drying rack. There was no sadness in the gesture, just a quiet acceptance. I didn't expect him to return. The driver. We had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, not with words or absence or silence. But I also didn't expect him to vanish. That's what made the waiting harder. The not knowing. I poured a cup of tea and sat in the living room, notebook in hand. The page from the day before stared back at me, raw, uneven, real. I added to it without hesitation, words spilling out in unpolished streams. I wrote about how it felt to be seen, how terrifying it was to acknowledge the ache of invisibility, how strange it was to experience both guilt and relief at the same time. I didn't notice how much time had passed until the tea had gone cold and the light through the windows had shifted from morning gold to the soft white of midday. I stood, stretched, and wandered to the front door, opening it to let the breeze in. There was a letter tucked between the handle and the frame. Unmarked. Folded. I opened it slowly, hands steady, breath uneven. I won't come unless you ask me to. M. Just that. Nothing more. I read it again, then folded it carefully and placed it inside the notebook. I didn't rush to respond. I didn't even know how. The rest of the day moved quietly. I cleaned the guest room, something I hadn't done in months. I dusted the shelves, washed the sheets, opened the window. I didn't know why I did it. Maybe because I needed to prepare a space for something new. Or maybe just to remind myself that I could. In the late afternoon, I walked to the market. I took my time, lingering at the produce section, smelling the apples, comparing shades of oranges. I bought flowers, fresh ones. Not for anyone else. Just for me. On the way back, I passed the river road. My feet stopped without my mind asking them to. I stood at the edge of the path, watching the water move, slow and steady, like it had all the time in the world. When I returned home, the house felt different again. Lighter, as though something had finally exhaled. The flowers I brought home were a soft yellow, delicate and open. I placed them in the same vase, now clean and ready, and set them in the same spot where the wildflowers had died. It felt symbolic, though I didn't try to force meaning into it. Sometimes a flower is just a flower. I spent the evening reading a book I had once loved but forgotten. The kind of story that reminded me of who I was before life became all about keeping things together. I read until the words blurred and the sky outside turned navy blue. I made myself dinner, nothing elaborate, but enough to fill the room with scent and warmth. I poured a single glass of wine and sipped it slowly, each swallow a small declaration of intention. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about what I would say if I asked him to come back. I didn't rehearse the words out loud, but they formed quietly in my mind. Not a plea. Not a justification. Just a truth, that his presence had reminded me of myself. But I didn't write the message. Not yet. The next morning, my husband returned. I heard his key in the lock, the door opening, the familiar footsteps across the tile. "I'm back," he called out. I answered from the kitchen, voice even, calm. He entered the room with a travel bag slung over one shoulder, setting it down beside a chair. "Good trip?" I asked. He nodded. "Productive." We exchanged a few more polite phrases, how the weather had been, what meetings he had, whether anything urgent had happened here. I told him the neighbor had brought over pie. I didn't mention the rest. He didn't ask. Later, as he unpacked upstairs, I stood in the hallway and listened to the sound of drawers opening and closing, of hangers sliding across rods. It all felt so mechanical. Like two people moving through choreography they hadn't rehearsed in years but couldn't seem to stop performing. At dinner, we sat across from each other with food between us and silence around us. He complimented the chicken. I thanked him. That was all. Afterward, he retreated to his office, the door closing softly behind him. I returned to the living room, the notebook waiting for me on the table. I opened it, flipped to the page where I had tucked the letter, and stared at it for a long time. Then I picked up my pen and wrote a single sentence. "I'm not ready for you to disappear." I didn't send it right away. I just sat with it. Because sometimes, writing something down is the first step towards saying it out loud. And even if he never saw the words, I had finally said them to myself. There's something final about finishing a sentence. Especially when that sentence has lived in your chest for days, unspoken and untouchable. The one I had written, "I'm not ready for you to disappear," was still resting at the top of the notebook page, unshared, unacknowledged by anyone but me. But it had weight. Not because it changed anything, but because it existed. Because I had allowed myself to write it. The following morning began like most others, with muted light creeping through the blinds and the sound of footsteps upstairs. My husband had already risen. I could hear the familiar rhythm of his movement, shower, closet, drawers opening and closing, the faint scrape of a belt buckle. It was comforting in the way a metronome is comforting, steady, predictable, never-changing tempo. I stayed in bed a few minutes longer than usual. Not because I was tired, but because I needed to feel the silence stretch before the day took over. When I finally rose, I moved through the routine slowly. Shower. Towel. Robe. Coffee. Each action precise, almost ceremonial, like I was observing myself from a distance. Downstairs, the kitchen was already awake. My husband had made his own toast and left the crumbs on the counter. A near-empty jar of marmalade sat beside a plate, his half-drunk coffee cooling nearby. There was no note. No greeting. Just evidence of presence, like footprints in snow. I cleaned up without resentment. It wasn't the gesture that bothered me, it was the vacancy. The sense that even when he was here, he wasn't really. That had become the hardest thing to ignore. The day moved with the same measured rhythm. I wrote for a while, not in the notebook, but in my head. Words came without effort, thoughts forming quietly beneath the surface of everything else. I folded laundry, answered a few emails, watered the plants. I even dusted the bookshelves, discovering a few titles I had forgotten I owned. I pulled one down and left it on the coffee table. Maybe I would start it later. Maybe not. By afternoon, the sky had shifted. Pale clouds stretched like linen across the blue, and a breeze moved through the house from the open kitchen window. I sat on the porch for a while, watching the street. Cars passed. A dog barked in the distance. Life continued in its quiet way. That's when I saw the envelope. It hadn't been there that morning, but now it sat tucked beneath the doormat. Small, cream-colored, folded with precision. My name wasn't written on it, but I knew. Instinctively. The way you know when someone is about to speak your name before they do. I picked it up and held it for a moment before going inside. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I had served countless dinners, held cups of tea during quiet mornings, signed documents, written grocery lists. The envelope felt like a contradiction in my hands, delicate, but heavy with implication. I opened it. I didn't disappear, it read. I just made room for your choice. That was all. No name. No return address. Just those words. I folded it back along the original crease and slipped it inside the back cover of my notebook. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just sat with it. Let it settle into the space it now occupied. Later that evening, my husband came home early. He brought wine. He placed it on the counter like a peace offering, though no conflict had been declared. I accepted the glass he poured and thanked him. We sat on opposite sides of the kitchen island, sipping slowly, exchanging small talk. He mentioned a conference he had been invited to, a weekend trip out of town, a chance to reconnect with some old colleagues. I nodded. Offered polite interest. Asked a few questions. He seemed relieved. We didn't discuss anything real. Not the distance. Not the silence. Not the layers we'd buried ourselves under. It felt like we had both accepted that some conversations were too brittle to hold in our hands. When the wine was gone, he excused himself, saying he had a few calls to make. I listened to the stairs creak as he climbed them, the door to his office clicking shut behind him. I remained in the kitchen, turning the empty glass in my hands. Eventually, I stood, walked to the cabinet, and pulled out a small stack of blank note cards. I sat back down and selected one. I thought about what to write. Something careful? Something open? Instead, I wrote nothing at all. I folded the card in half, placed it inside an envelope, and sealed it. I left it on the table. That night, as I lay in bed, I didn't think about what came next. I didn't try to map out what the following week would hold, or how I would explain any of it to anyone else. I didn't rehearse a speech or prepare for a confrontation. I just lay there. Awake. Still. Honest. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to happen. I felt like something had already begun. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just quiet and true. And that was enough.